looking at a $250,000 grant. In normal years, you'd be looking at $250,000 of match requirement. This year, we're looking at $25,000. So instead of, we're looking at a $275,000 project, and instead of the $500,000 project. What's going to happen with this is once after all applications are received, they'll all be will determine eligibility for the applications. And once all eligible applications are determined, we'll send them off to be scored. The state will score the application, and then 2 independent reviewers will also score each eligible application. We'll then start looking at funding, and we'll start funding from the top down, the highest score on down. Once we reach the 35 million in COVID funds, any applications that have the reduced match will be given the opportunity to look at providing documentation and revising their budgets back up to the dollar for dollar match. And if you're able to provide that documentation to increase your match from the 10% match to the dollar for dollar match, then we will be able to continue funding until we hit the minimum score of 50, or we run out of the 76 million in total funds. What is matching funds? Matching funds can be in the form of in-kind raw commodity. It can be in-kind family labor of not more than 25% of the project. It can be applicant cash, loan, line or credit, or third-party cash, or third-party in-kind. What it cannot be is non-federal grant sources, non-federal grant sources. So those are some of the things that we're looking for with the matching funds. Greg, I think you're going to take over talking about the other thing that is changing within our program this year.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And before I do, looks like we had a question from Bill. It says, does a value-added grant require a feasibility study? And is the person who prepares the feasibility study required to be a CPA? So the answer to that question is, it depends, Bill. If you're coming in for an emerging market project for more than $50,000, yes, you would need a feasibility study to do that grant. And that feasibility study would need to be prepared by a qualified consultant. So that means that it needs to be somebody independent of the farm and someone who has the expertise, the knowledge, the history, the background, that type of thing, to prepare such a study. I hope that answers your question. And I think we had a second question that came in, and I believe Dan answered that one pretty well there in the chat, if you guys want to take a look. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other changes, and scoring criterion 3 was really the biggest one. So for those of you that have already started on your applications, or those of you that haven't, if you take a look at the application toolkit, you'll notice in the latter parts of it is the scoring section. And the third option in there is commitments and support. And commitments and support used to include 4 components, and it will again next year, but for this year only, we've reduced that down to 3 components. So those 3 components will be independent producer commitment, end user commitment, and third-party commitment. We will not have the nature and quality of commitment, the 4th category, this cycle. You can move to the next slide, please. So what does that mean? That means we had to reallocate the points a little bit, because this section still scores a maximum of 10 points as it did before, but the points have been reallocated. So if you are a sole producer or sole proprietor, you would receive 1 point for the independent producer commitments. But if you're more than one producer, and that can be a husband and wife situation, a situation where you own the farm with someone else, can be multiple different things. But if it's more than one producer, you would get 2 points now for this section. Next slide. And when it gets down to end user commitments, we've bumped up the points here a little bit. And really what it comes down to is whether or not it's well-documented commitment from one user or it's well-documented commitment from more than one user. And basically what it comes down to is it's 0, 2, and 4. This used to be 0, 1, and 2. So now you can get a maximum of 4 points for end user commitment. And next slide, please. Same thing for third-party commitment. This was a 0, 1, and 2 point category before. Now you can get 0, 2, or 4 points, so a maximum of 4 points for this section. But again, it comes down to well-documented commitment from one third party or well-documented commitment from more than one, on whether or not you get the 2 points or the 4 points. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So if you attended the previous training that we did, you'll know that we have some tools on our website. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to take a look. So the link there will take you to the Value Added Producer Grant webpage. And from there, you're going to find some very useful tools. Next slide. And one of the most important of which is going to be the application toolkit. Some of you that have already started your application and kind of gotten your project going before we received the additional funds and issued the amended notice might have downloaded the application toolkits that were published back in December. That is perfectly fine. If you haven't, there are updated application toolkits on the website right now. The big difference are between these and the ones that were published back in December is that scoring criterion number 3 has been changed. Now, if you use the old version that was published in December, that's perfectly fine, like I mentioned before, but we will still score in accordance with the amended notice. So there will no longer be additional points awarded if you provide cash match to the project. It'll just be broken down between those 3 items that I just reviewed earlier. And there are 2 different application toolkits. There's one for both the planning grant and the working capital. Make sure you pick the one that's appropriate to your project. And you can only apply for one at any given time. So you have to kind of decide, am I going to go the planning route, working capital route? I can't intermingle expenses or funds between the 2. Next slide. So embedded within the toolkits is the actual template for applying. You'll notice that the template is pretty user-friendly. Start at the top, go to the bottom. Some of the spots are going to be fill in the blank. There's going to be other sections where you check and answer, and then there's going to be some narrative sections. When you're filling this out, I'd encourage you to make sure you read the instructions very closely, especially in the narrative sections, and make sure you answer all aspects of what's being asked in that question. If you do that, you'll have a much better chance of success when you apply. Next slide. Also embedded within the application toolkits are going to be several links to the different forms that you're going to need to apply, to include the government forms, as well as links to things like the DUNS registration and the SAMS registration. I mentioned this in the last training, but please, if you're registering your business for SAMS or you're getting a DUNS number, use these links that we're providing here that are embedded within the toolkit. Do not go to one of the pay for registration sites. This is an absolutely free service for you, or free registration process for you, both when you register and in subsequent years when you renew those registrations. There's no need to pay anyone for it, but unfortunately there's some scams out there where they're trying to charge people for this service. And then if you have a project that's either related to hemp or alcohol, there are additional links provided there for the licensing that's going to be required to be submitted with those projects. Next slide, please. Just a little screenshot of the SAM and DUNS registration links. Like I said, don't pay anyone, go directly to these pages, and you can do it for free. Next slide. And you can kind of click through about 4 or 5 times. There's going to be several appendices that pop up. Embedded within the back of the toolkits, you're going to find several appendices that are included back there, and they include things for reserve funds. They include priority points. The tribes would qualify for the socially disadvantaged priority points as well as reserve funds. So I'd make sure you take a close look at those. But for tribal applications in particular, there's also an appendices for that. And it's a little questionnaire, like a 5 or 6 points. I think they're looking for you to answer there to kind of determine eligibility for the project. We've over the past couple of years really been able to clean that up and make it a little bit clearer so that the tribes have an avenue to get in and apply. And that appendices will walk you through answering those questions. Next slide. And then finally, on our webpage, and the webpage link was, I don't know, 4 or 5 slides back there. But if you click on that webpage, you kind of take a look around there. You're going to find some great information. One of the really nice tools you'll find on there are the fact sheets. We have them on locally produced food products, anaerobic digesters, what the definition of a harvester, and what we're looking for with that type of application, as well as mid-tier value chains. Yeah, I'd really encourage you to take a look around on the website. Read through those if you'd like, and there's some great information on there. Next slide. Now I'll open it up for questions here, but if there's anything you would like to ask outside of what's being covered here, if you'd like to talk to either Mike or myself directly, you are more than welcome to contact either one of us, and we will we'll help you out with your questions. Our contact information is included there. I don't see any chat questions at this time.
There is one in there, Greg, that we didn't cover. Are BIA funds considered non-federal sources for match? I guess it depends on where they're coming from. I need to see a little bit more about it. I know that there's ones like the Keep Eagle Awards, that is not considered federal funds. That is not a problem, but I need to understand what funds you're really talking about. So maybe if you contact me and with examples, and we can take a look at that.
We have another question. It was partially answered already on whether a feasibility study is required, and so yes, a feasibility study would be required for the working capital. But then the second part of that question, does the person who does the study, do they need to be a CPA?
Yeah, and what I was mentioning there, Dan, in the response was that doesn't necessarily have to be a CPA. What it needs to be is it needs to be a qualified consultant. So it needs to be somebody independent of the producer who has qualified to prepare that document. So they have the working history, the education, experience in that industry to be able to take a look at a project and determine the viability of it, the feasibility of it. And we do look for them to state at the end of the feasibility study whether or not it is a feasible project or not. And yes, kelp and wild salmon do qualify. So you would come in for the kelp and salmon, we'd probably be looking at you coming in under the harvester category, I would imagine. And we've had those kind of projects in the past, depending on what you're looking to do with the kelp and salmon. They are eligible agricultural commodities.
And we had another question, just curiosity on the matching funds. And I know that it's helpful with this supplementary 35 million to have that match reduced from 50% down to 10%. But still that is a significant match. And could you just talk a little bit more of what are some strategies that people have used in the past for finding that match?
Sure.
Are you able to use product for it? Are there other ideas on that?
The product itself, Dan, would not be eligible, but the raw ag commodity going into it. So, for example, in the wild salmon that was just brought up by Andrea, the wild salmon, whatever the value of the caught fish would be able to be used as part of your match. Family labor could be in kind, could be part of it. So people working on the production of it. If you're hiring that labor out, that can be part of the eligible expenses. Could be, in the case of a planning grant, I've seen where some of the providers say they normally charge, $75 an hour to do a feasibility study. Sometimes because they believe in the project, they'll say, okay, we're only going to charge you $65 an hour for this, and we will take the balance of that as in-kind match. So those are some of the, offhand, those are some of the in-kind type of valuations, and also can be cash. but to your point, Dan, you know, the product itself. So if you're making the strawberry jam, the jam itself could not be the match, but the strawberry itself could be. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's very helpful. I will also note that if anyone has a current award from the Native American Agriculture Fund, I know that that they have generally been allowing people to use that as a match. You're going to want to follow up with Native American Ag Fund on that, but that's another possibility. And then other forms of in-kind, Mike? Are there other strategies that people have used to help to come up with that match?
You know, Mike, I'd like to kind of add a
Yeah,
little
go
comment
ahead.
to that, which is that if I were building a budget for my project, and especially considering what we've changed, commitment and support section where cash match, you know, score higher than any other application, I would probably start at the top and go to the bottom. And what I mean by starting at the top is you're going to harvest some sort of commodity, whether it's salmon, some corn, what have you, and that harvested commodity is worth something that you're, you know, the commodity that you're going to be using for the value added venture. So whatever the value of that commodity is, you should start there. There's no cap on it. And I would be willing to bet that if you're doing a 10% match, reduced match, you'd probably have your match covered right there. But if you don't, then the next thing I would look at would be the in-kind labor. And in-kind labor does have a cap, but a lot of people get this confused, but only in-kind labor has a cap, and it's 25% of the project. So with the reduced match option, we're talking about 25% of the project, not 25% of the match. If you're coming in for the reduced match of 10%, you're not going to have an issue because just the way the math works, your entire match could be in-kind labor. So you'd be perfectly fine there. And then between the in-kind raw commodity and then the in-kind labor, if you're still having a little bit of trouble coming up with the match, there's some third-party contributions that maybe you could look at, but then we'd probably be looking at cash as the next option. But I think if you look at it that way, you'll probably get most of your budget or your match covered in that manner.
One of the things that can also be a stumbling point for a lot of applicants, not only Native but anybody, they say, well, I have this piece of equipment or I have this property that I'm using for this, so that should be able to be in kind. For this program, it cannot be. So your match has to be for all the same as your as the grant eligible activities. So just so we kind of dispel some of those questions, because I've had those numerous times where people say, well, I have this piece of equipment that I just bought that should be able to be matched. It can't be.
Right.
And how do we value family labor? It'd be the value of what the process is. So for example, one time I had an attorney say, well, I'm an attorney and I get $300 an hour to be an attorney, so I'm going to make strawberry jam and charge $300 an hour. It doesn't work that way. It has to be the valuation of what you're doing for the value added process. So if you're you know, a lot of times we look on Bureau of Labor statistics to come up with what an average cost would be, or, you know, it has to be a reasonable amount. So really, to answer your question, Diane, it really depends on what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Can a feed store qualify for grant funding? A feed store itself would not. You would have to be actually producing the feed. So I've had the example where I've had, you know, a cheese processor here in Wisconsin call me up and say, I'm making a value add product. I'm making cheese. I make great cheese. Congratulations. Do you milk the cows? No, I buy all my milk. Unfortunately, that's not going to be unfortunately, that would not be eligible. You have to actually be producing the ag product.
All right.
Do you need to be producing all of that ag product?
You have to, you're producing the ag product that's going to be utilized in the value added process that you're growing. So for example, if you're making salsa and you grow tomatoes, that's fine. That's a commodity that's going to be used. You don't have to produce the onions and the peppers. If you do, that's great, but you don't have to produce everything that goes into the value added product. Like for example, if you're making ice cream, you'd be bringing the milk to the party, but you're not going to bring the vanilla and the nuts that would go into a vanilla nut ice cream, right? So it would be the ag product that you're bringing into the venture, and you have to produce at least 51% of that ag product yourself.
Right. There was a question a little bit while back in the chats about change in physical state. So what's being asked there is there's 5 methodologies. So your product, your raw commodity, the ag product that you're growing or raising, needs to go through one of the methodologies in order to be considered as a value-added product. And the first one, and probably the backbone of the program, is the change in physical state. Mike just gave the example of taking tomatoes, changing that tomato from its tomato form and making something with it. Salsa can't be reversed. It's an irreversible process. That's what we're looking at for the change in physical state. It could be milk, cheese. It could be some sort of meat, reindeer meat. I believe it was just mentioned here a second ago. You're processing the reindeer meat into some sort of packaged meat products that you're going to sell. That's irreversible. You would qualify under the change in physical state. The other 4 options, in addition to change in physical state, are produced in a manner that enhances the value of the ag commodity. What we're typically looking at there is we're looking at things like organic, maybe free-range chicken, those types of things. Then there's also, for the third one, there's physical segregation. So this one's not looked at all that often, but we do get a couple applications here and there. Probably the best scenario or best example here would be GMO corn versus non-GMO corn. Then there's the 4th one is the farm or ranch-based renewable energy projects. We're looking at the anaerobic digesters there. If you're looking at an on-farm energy project, we might be able to help out. And then the 5th one, and this one's probably picking up the most steam over the last few years, is the locally produced agricultural food product. So if you're producing something on farm and you're not doing anything further to change the physical state of it, you're just selling that raw commodity, but you're selling it within the state it's produced or within 400 miles of the farm, and you're marketing it as a locally grown and produced food product, and you can receive a premium for the product by doing so, then that's enough to qualify as well.
And then the question on reindeer meat, if that's a commodity that is sold, I see no reason why that would not be eligible for value added. The question here also about COVID-19 funds. Congress has determined that everybody has been affected by COVID, so there's no other certification that is needed to qualify for these funds.
And Diane, just want to say hi. It's been a long time since I've seen your name pop up. Hello. What about wild gathered? So when it comes to berries, jams, those type of things, yeah, there's a potential there. But really, I think what we're looking for is, do you have the legal right to harvest the commodity from the land where you're getting it? So if you do, then we could potentially look at you as a harvester and potentially do the project for you. But you would have to have the legal rights to harvest that commodity.
I raised bison after USDA approved processing. We want to make products from the hides, horns, skulls. Does that qualify? Yeah, if you're raising the bison, and so what you're saying is you're not talking about the meat, but the products. If you've raised the bison, you're taking the hides and stuff, and you're making I don't know whatever you're making. I would assume I think that probably would, as long as you're raising the bison, Lucille.
What was number 1 and number 2 for the methodology? So I'll go through them just real quick again. So there's number 1's change in physical state. Number 2 is the produced in a manner that enhances the value of the ag commodity. So organic, free range, that type of thing. Then there's physical segregation. So your GMO versus non-GMO. Then there's the farmer ranch renewable energy. And then the 5th one is the locally produced agricultural food product.
So I raise alpaca. Would a grant like this be able to use to buy equipment to make fiber into yarn, or could the grant be used to pay other processors to the fiber into product? Yes, so that would be part of you would not be able to buy the equipment to make the fiber into the yarn, but you could pay somebody to spin the fiber into yarn and then make socks and things of that nature. That would be part of the processing. We wouldn't pay you to take the fiber off the alpaca. I would assume you're shearing it or something along those lines. We wouldn't pay you to shear the alpaca, but to clean the fiber, to spin it, that processing would all be part of the value-added product, processing of that product.
Can starting a website and shipping costs be covered expenses under this grant? Absolutely, and those are very common expenses that we pay for.
What about selling worm castings as compost growing medium? Greg, you had something like this that we've already talked about. Do you remember what?
Yeah, it was a little bit removed though from the worm part of it. So I'd like to know a little bit more about what you have going on here, Susan, and then maybe we can help out. Maybe reach out to us afterwards. We have done composting projects before where, say, the byproduct of the agricultural commodity, chickens, what have you, are then composted and then sold as fertilizer, compost, different things. And worms were involved in creating the compost, but I'm not sure what yours entails.
Then our native hemp farmers eligible apply. That's really going to depend upon if you have, if your tribe, if the tribe has a license to grow under the 2018 Farm Bill, or you live in a state that has a license in accordance with the 2018 Farm Bill. I don't think we had that slide, did we, Greg, on hemp this time? Reach out to us and or go to the AMS website, and you'll be able to see all the tribes that have the 2018 license, and all the states that do. If they have chosen not to be in, if they've chosen to continue processing under the 2014 Farm Bill, you would not be eligible this year to apply.
Right. And we got a question also, what about selling native plants to be used by other agencies for post-fire restoration? That's going to be a tough one, Susan. I don't think we'd be able to make that one work because it probably wouldn't fit one of the methodologies. If you're selling a live plant and agencies are just basically planting it for post-fire restoration, it's not really meeting any of the methodologies for the change of physical state or the produced manner. So it'd be tough for us to do that because there's no post-harvest value-added process being done.
Greg and Mike, this is Ted. You've done a great job addressing questions, especially when it comes to gathering and the legal right to gather. Dan, Cornelius, and the team at IAC have developed some expertise on how to work with tribes on harvesting different types of commodities like wild rice and fish, of course. So I would encourage folks, to reach out to Mike and Greg, and the Intertribal Ag Council's Technical Assistance Network can really help you feel your way through the program as well.
Yeah, and Ted, if I could also just add on, we had a question earlier about selling fish to the Commodity Food Distribution Program. We can provide more assistance there. It's a little bit outside the scope of the webinar today. We do have a recording on the YouTube channel of becoming a certified federal vendor. That is one big step. There are some other opportunities. Just last week, or actually just at the beginning of this week on Monday, the ability for tribes to apply for funding for self-purchase had closed, but that's going to be coming back around next year. So there's other opportunities there. And I think where the connection with this program is, and the connection with the program that we're going to hear about in just a couple of minutes, it is how do we help to build more of the supply chain? How do we have more product that we're adding value to and that is feeding our communities? And so it's really setting up that ability to get into those procurement opportunities. And I can say one of the success stories that we highlighted on the first training this year for Value Added Producer Grant was Red Cliff. Red Cliff used the planning grant to conduct a feasibility study. That feasibility study then was used as the basis to secure additional funding, and including from the Keep Siegel Fast Track, and then also one of the Rural Business Development grants that's about to be talked about, and an ANA grant, and then some other supplemental funding, including CARES Act money went in as well. They opened up the Red Cliff Fish Company back in late October, beginning of November, and now we're connecting them in to some of these other federal procurement opportunities. So it's really, some of this takes some time to put in place, but having the support for doing the feasibility studies, or having that support to cover your operational expenses to get that value added product going is I think what is so exciting about this. Last thing I'll say before we turn it over to Rural Business Development Grant is that this is a fairly long application, but the application toolkits are a great resource for helping to break down where do you need to focus on. And if you haven't written a lot of grants before, don't get too intimidated. It's kind of long, but just read those instructions. And if you have questions, feel free to follow up with our staff at IAC, and that we can always help to connect with rural development, and you have the contact information for the program staff as well. So don't get too intimidated by the length of the application. It is long, it takes time, and you really need to make sure that you answer those questions to get adequately to get the full scoring points. But thank you both to Greg and Mike for joining. Really appreciate taking the time to get on a second training with us today.
I'll stick around if there's other questions at the end. I'll put it on mute and I'll be listening. If you have other questions, let me know, please.
Thanks, Mike.
Greg, did you want to say anything in closing?
No, I just want to thank everybody. Again, I'll be around as well. So if you have any questions, but you're also welcome to contact us directly. I think you're going to share our contact information if we can. So I saw somebody had asked for it just a minute ago in the conversation or in the chat feature.
The other thing,
Yeah.
if we do have specific questions that come to us, we're going to get you in contact with the right people within the individual states that you'd be working with, so you develop that relationship. And I think, Dan, you can attest to this. It's important that you develop that relationship with each individual state that you're going to be working with, because they're the ones that you're going to be reviewing your application, and when it's awarded, or if it's awarded, that you'll be working through the reimbursement process and the whole administering of the grant. So it's pretty important that we get you to know who you're going to be working with to develop that professional relationship. So with that, I'm going to go on mute.
And I can 100% attest to that. That's part of where Mike and I, as he was saying at the beginning, got to know each other through that process of working with tribes and having having a good relationship with your local staff, not just for rural development, but for most of the USDA programs, is very helpful. And then just also want to say that, yes, this recording is going to be available on the IAC YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So anyone who missed any portion or want to go back and look at it for reference, it'll be on that YouTube channel.
And Dan, maybe Lisa can pull up her video now and come off mute, but I just want to make one thing clear about when Mike was talking about states, we're not talking about the state government. We didn't really talk about rural development structure today, but just so you know, rural development is organized by state offices. So the state reference is really rural development, federal rural development employees that are that administer and work on programs in a given jurisdiction. So Mike used to be the value added guy among other duties in Wisconsin. So just know that that's not a state government function. It's a state office structure within rural development. And Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ted.
Okay, again, my name is Lisa Sharp. I am currently working primarily with the Rural Business Development Grant, as well as the Rural Cooperative Development Grant in the national office as part of the Program Management Division. So again, I'm excited to be with you today and share a little bit of information about the Rural Business Development Grant. Um, Continuing with the format that we had earlier, if you have questions, if you want to type those in to the chat box, we'll try to get to those. Any that I'm unable to get to or to answer today, I'll be glad to follow up with you or put you in touch with the right person as Ted mentioned, at the state um, field office level within USDA rural development. So we could go ahead and proceed to the next slide. Thank you. Just to give you a little bit of background on the program, you may remember this. This program has been in existence for quite some time, but recently went a regulation rewrite in 2015. It was formerly known as the Rural Business Enterprise Grant, RBEG. We have lots of acronyms within the government, or the Rural Business Opportunity Grant. So RBEG and RBALG were commonly the reference points. But with the rewrite in 2015, it was renamed the Rural Business Development Grant, and we still have the divisions, and we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between RBEG and RBALG and how that still fits together. But I've given you a technical reference there about the background of where that program emerged from. The program is really designed to provide technical assistance and training for small rural businesses. Typically, we refer to that as anything less than 50 new employees or less than $1 million in gross revenue. So that's the end user of this program. Eligible applicants are nonprofit organizations, Indian tribes, nonprofit cooperatives, and educational institutions, which are organized under state and federal laws. So these are the eligible applicants, and they're typically organizations that are working with for-profit businesses. So it's kind of an intermediary in place for this one. If we could go ahead to the next slide. The Rural Business Development Grant must be used for projects that benefit rural areas or towns with populations less than 50,000. In many of our communities, that's not an issue. But for others, there can be some fine lines there. So make sure that the area that would benefit from this particular project would have a population of less than 50,000. Rural Business Development Grant Program is really pretty highly competitive across the country. So as always is the case, it seems like there's never enough grant funds to supply the demand. And that's certainly the case with the Rural Business Development Grant in many of our states. While there's no maximum grant amount, smaller requests are given a higher priority through the scoring criteria. We'll talk a little bit more about that. What is so nice about the Rural Business Development Grant, and this is a little bit different from the value added, you'll notice, is that there's no cost sharing requirement or no match requirement for this grant. However, there are some scoring criteria that come into play that if you do have a match, it may be to your benefit. These are projects that are typically designed to be completed within 1 year. So think about that as you're thinking about the project that you would want to undertake. It's something that can be accomplished in a 1 year time frame. Next slide, please. Types of rural business development grants. As I mentioned before, with the regulation rewrite, it's now referred to as the Rural Business Development Grant Program. But there's still the breakdown between the Enterprise Grant Program and the Opportunity Grant Program. So let's talk a little bit more about what we mean by each of those terms. Next slide, please. The RBEG or RBEG, Rural Business Enterprise Grant Program, all of those are common terms when associated with this, provides funding for construction, acquisition, land development, equipment, and capitalization of revolving loan funds, can support business startups and working capital needs in rural areas. So when you're thinking about your project, you really need to decide which area it fits into. Some examples of this RBEG program might be any type of land acquisition projects may be associated with a business park or anything like that, construction or renovation of buildings, feasibility studies. This is a pretty common project among these types of programs that we see: leadership and entrepreneur training, and rural business incubators. They're all very common activities within the RBEG program. Now, RBOG, there's also that side of the RBDG program. This particular program supports projects that provide technical assistance, business development, and economic development planning. And that's the key word there, is the planning. Each state is allocated a separate RBDG allocation annually. So each state has their own funding, and those decisions are made locally. But 10% of the funds that they receive are allocated for RBOG projects. And again, some examples of particular RBOG programs might be long-term business strategic planning, technology-based economic development. These are a little bit more rare in terms of project development activities that we see, but it is important to note, and you'll see on the application itself, you can identify which of these program areas that you would like to be considered for, whether it be RBEG or RBOG. I know that's a little bit confusing, but once you read that a few times, I think with the examples that are given, it'll give you a better idea of where some projects that you're thinking about might be able to fit in. Let's go to the next slide, please. When we think about rural business development grant funding, there are a few set-aside programs within this particular area. The first of those, in no particular order, is the Strategic Economic and Community Development. Again, another acronym. We refer to this one as SEC-D. And these are projects that promote regional economic development and capitalize upon the unique strengths of specific rural areas. They're programs that help applicants overcome multi-jurisdictional changes by helping leverage federal, state, local, or private funding. They're typically regionally focused projects that help USDA resources have a larger impact, enabling greater wealth creation and quality of life improvement. So these are projects that typically cross multi-jurisdictional lines, whether it be county lines or city borders. They involve typically more than one particular applicant. One applicant might be charged with the administration of the project itself, but it typically involves a multitude of jurisdictions within the community. This particular set aside does require a separate application. It's not difficult, but this is one that goes through our Innovation Center at USDA, and they will help review that. And it's an extra, very simple form that needs to be completed, but it is important to do that if you'd like to be considered for this set aside program. The project should be also included in some type of regional plan that has been completed and considered by the community as a priority for their area. So again, important to if you're interested in that, to reach out to your state USDA Rural Development Office and identify the contacts. We'll share more information about that in a few minutes. If we could have the next slide, please. Additional set-asides for rural business development grant funding are persistent poverty. These are projects that will provide targeted support to persistent poverty communities. And I've provided the link here for you to be able to check to see if the community that you live in or work in or planning a project in would qualify for this type of funding. Another set-aside would be the Native American Persistent Poverty set-aside. These are projects that will provide targeted support to Native American persistent poverty communities. And finally, the Native American set-aside itself, which provides funding for projects that provide targeted support to Native American communities. So there's really a variety of funds that you can apply for, and you would need to identify on your application if you would like to be considered for one of these particular set-asides. The set-asides are maintained at the national level, and once a project is received within the state, that advances to the national office for competition. One thing is important to remember, though, that if you are not selected as part of the national office set-aside funds to receive that, then you still can be considered for the state allocation. So those decisions are made in a timely manner so as to allow projects that aren't selected at the national level, oftentimes because we have limited funds, that they can revert back to the state for consideration at that level. Okay, just to give you an idea, last year on the Native American funding, it was a bit of an odd year. We had some extra funds that were carried over, but we had $4,150,000 for the Native American set aside. So that kind of gives you an idea of what's available for that particular set aside. We could go ahead to the next slide.
Lisa, while they're moving, could I add a little something
Absolutely.
more about the set aside? So this is Ted Bulow again, and with the set aside for tribes, the Native American set aside has stayed pretty constant at around $4 million for the past couple decades. And with that, we usually fund probably about 30 to 35 projects through the set aside funds. And just be aware that the traditional funds that if you weren't selected in the Native American set aside that are distributed out through our state office structure, the traditional grants tend to be much smaller because the pools of money are much smaller for the state office funds rather than through the set aside. So in the set aside program, we see some much larger grants than through the traditional program, but still we're working with only $4 million. So we try to spread those to as many eligible high scoring projects as we can each year. And it's a good opportunity to try to compete for both pieces of both pies. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks, Lisa.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ted. Ted's exactly right. Oftentimes within the set aside funding, grant awards are somewhat larger than they are within the state allocation. Many states, as I said, there's high demand for that funding. And each state operates their program a little bit differently when it comes to funding awards. And many states, I know, limit their or encourage applicants not to ask for more than $50,000 so that they can make their state allocation extend as far as they possibly can. That's not the case in every state. But once again, a good opportunity to establish a relationship with your particular USDA Rural Development Office in your state to learn more about how their program is set up. When we talk a little bit about scoring criteria, it's important to note that all applications are evaluated based on the following criteria. And these are really pretty easy criteria, nothing too difficult associated with these. But we're going to be looking for evidence showing job creation at local businesses. So you will have to verify, and we know that things change. I mean, it's easy to think that we're going to be able to create 5 jobs or 10 jobs, and then by the time you get your application together, it's funded a few months later. Things change, and that's to be expected. But we would like to have some type of a really well-educated guess, I guess we could say, an expectation of what you expect the outcomes of the project to be. We're going to be looking to see if there's a non-federal funding committed to the project and what percent of the overall project that might be. While it's not required, scoring criteria does work to your benefit if you have some additional funding that can be committed. And again, it would be non-federal funds. And in terms of that commitment, we're going to be looking for actual letters from those funding sources indicating what the funding amount would be and when it's available to be used for this project. And we'll be looking at the economic need in the area to be served. So there's a variety of demographic data that comes into play. It's very well defined on the application itself, what we're going to be looking for. Consistency with local economic development priorities. And I mentioned that back on the SEC-D, or the Strategic Economic and Community Development set aside. It's important that, that these projects are part of a community prioritized effort. So anytime that you're putting forth a project, if you can demonstrate that it's been widely considered throughout the community and has been identified as a real priority, again, point scoring will look for that. We'll be looking at the experience of the grantee with similar efforts, and it's important to include good documentation that notes experience of the organization or the staff that will be implementing the project. And then other factors that are identified in the NOSA that is available. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please.
Lisa, can we address one question before we move on? It's actually back
Sure.
on the set aside slide. So someone asked if they could apply for more than one set aside. So I know that with SecD, there's an additional document that folks will have to submit. They don't have to submit any additional documentation for the tribal set aside. So you just want to work with whomever you're submitting that application to, our field staff, to make sure that they know that it's a Native American set aside, and then it will automatically cascade into the traditional funding if it weren't selected in the set aside. But how about for persistent poverty? And could someone apply both for SecD and the tribal set asides?
It's possible that they could do that. They would need to note that on their application, that they would be applying for that. And then when the applications are considered, we try to look across the board at applicants and projects and make funding decisions based on funds that are all available through these particular set asides. So, yes.
And I would just add, your best bet, the smallest applicant pool is going to be in the Native American set aside one. You're only going to be competing against tribes or other eligible applicants, including tribes and nonprofits and educational institutions, as referenced on an earlier slide. And each of those, if they're not the tribe, has to show and certify that at least 75% of the benefits are going to flow to members of federally recognized tribes. So if you meet those criteria, that's going to be the smallest applicant pool with the largest amount of grant dollars available, proportionally, I should say. So just know that that will be the least competitive. We still are oversubscribed, but we're less oversubscribed usually in the tribal set aside.
Good point. Thank you, Ted. I've encouraged people to go ahead and enter their questions, and then I've been busy looking, so feel free to jump in, Ted, if you see others that we can address.
Will do. I've been answering them as we've been going along, so no worries. You just stay focused.
Sounds good. All right, and getting started with your application, I've got some good news and bad news. It's a fairly easy application, but for the fiscal year 2021 program, applications are actually due on March 31st. So, and this is the first year that we've kind of had a national application deadline that we're implementing so that we can, that states can be on more of a unified application period. So again, it is a fairly easy application, and there's a toolkit and a checklist, which I think is really an amazing tool to help you navigate the application process. But applications are accepted through USDA Rural Development's local or state offices, and that's that state office structure that Ted referenced earlier. So these state offices can be identified just by Googling USDA Rural Development. You can look at the Rural Business Development Grant. It will provide a link directly to the state offices. It's pretty easy to find. Each state has their own website and provides contact information for rural business service staff, and that's what you'll be looking for. Grant applicants are advised to refer to the NOSA. This is a publication that provides information for application timelines and specific requirements. As I mentioned, our deadline for applications this year is March 31st, but there's some specific requirements that you might want to reference. And they're also available on the website that I mentioned too. Grant awardees must complete required paperwork and comply with the terms and conditions of the award, and those are outlined pretty clearly. One thing I did want to mention, and I think Mike referenced this earlier, is the need to have a SAMS number and a DUNS number if you're planning to make an application for federal funding. And this may be, you may have this and it might not be an issue, but just want to throw it out there that there are some third-party organizations that are approaching some nonprofits and indicating that they, for a small fee, that they can get that registration accomplished for you. And I just want to make it clear that there's no fee to apply for these, and organizations typically do this themselves. But one thing you should be aware of, that sometimes it does take a little time to get those SAMs and DUNS numbers if you don't already have them. So you'll want to get started on that right away if you do have an intention of applying for funding this year. All right, next slide.
And Lisa, we're aware that it's a little bit of awkward timing because applications are due 2 weeks today. But we
Yes.
decided in partnership with Intertribal Ag Council that this webinar will have shelf life for next year as well. So sorry that we're a little late in this year's calendar. There's still a chance that you could apply this year. So if you do want to apply, make due haste. But also know that we're expecting the program to be relatively similar, if not very similar to the way it is this year, next year. So thank you.
Absolutely. And this is one of those programs that it's really good to kind of keep in your tool belt as the year progresses. And if you run across projects, it's a fairly simple application, but it's just a really exciting program that USDA has to offer. And if you haven't used it before, I would encourage you to consider it if you're looking at project development in a rural area. One thing I wanted to share with you also is just understanding what happens after you receive funding and the servicing associated with the Rural Business Development Grant. Sometimes you think about, applying for a grant and everyone's excited when you find out that you got it, and then the real work starts. So understanding your commitment and what it means to receive a grant from USDA Rural Development. We're going to be actively servicing these projects at the state level. So if you don't already know the USDA folks in your community with rural development and the rural business program staff, I would encourage you to reach out to them as soon as you can when you begin thinking about making an application. We're going to be looking for financial status reports and project performance activity as required of all grantees on a quarterly basis while the project is active. So for that first year, while you're working on implementation, every quarter you'll have kind of 2 reports that will be due, a financial status report, and then we'll be looking for just a performance activity report of how things are going. And then that will be required annually after the completion of the project or after that if there's a project extension. For project performance reports should include the following: a comparison of actual accomplishments versus the objectives that were established or laid out in the original application, any problems or delays that you might be encountering, objectives and a timetable established for the next reporting period, what you hope to accomplish by the next time you report, and then any special reporting requirements such as jobs supported or businesses assisted, any other economic development achievements that you might want to note. Next slide.
And Lisa, I have a question. No one asked it, but I do know this has been an issue in the past. I don't know if anything's changed, but what about reporting on, like, say, a revolving loan fund and or real property that might require reporting because it's not necessarily a depreciating asset or something that's in a fixed time?
And that's a good point because we didn't talk about that earlier, but you can establish a revolving loan fund with rural business development grant funds. It's not as common as other projects simply because, especially within state allocations, typically if they're 50,000 or less, that's difficult to establish a revolving loan fund with. But I've personally seen a few that have been successful. Again, we would be looking at when it comes to servicing and reporting, just kind of where you're at in the process, if you've acquired property or where you're at in the establishment of the fund. If you are, hopefully you had some other funding that was maybe part of the revolving loan fund as you were making applications. So, where are you at in that process? Have you begun to relend funds back out? What's your process? What's your application process for your particular loan fund? There's some additional requirements that we'll be looking at for revolving loan funds, and it's similar to our intermediary relending program. that USDA Rural Development has as well.
And thanks,
So-
and I'll just add, Lisa, because of the set aside and because of either tribally operated revolving loan funds and even more commonly Native community development financial institutions, it has been a bigger portion of the Native set asides, and
Mhm.
grants on the set aside are you still have a regulatory or a policy cap of $500,000, but I have seen grants up to $500,000 even within the last 2 fiscal years for revolving loan funds through the tribal set aside. And that last one that I mentioned, $500,000, wasn't to a Native community development financial institution, but many times those types of organizations are accessing this grant program for capital, whether it's the first time for seed capital or recapitalization. But thanks. Don't want to go too deep down that.
Sure, and you're correct in that with those particular set asides, additional funding would be available beyond what's available at the state allocation level. So,
Hi,
absolutely.
Lisa.
Yes,
This is Cindy.
yes, Cindy.
Hi,
Cindy Mason is also works with our staff in the national office, and Cindy's had a lot of experience working with these set aside programs, especially.
And I just wanted to point this out. I mean, you're doing great, but just going forward, because of the revolving loan funds, we have a lot of issues, or we've had a lot of in the past. When we're talking about the servicing of these and the reporting, just point out that if they do decide to come in for a grant to establish an RLF, that revolving loan fund and the servicing of it and the reporting is forever until at such time they no longer wish to continue with an RLF and they return the funds back to the agency. We have a lot in the past and recently that, oh, well, we've already revolved all the money out, so we can do what we want with it. And they still have to do eligible projects and provide servicing and reporting back to the agency until such time they no longer wish to continue and just return the funds back to us. The same with the buildings. If they do real property, it's kind of forever until they sell and we get our prorated share back. I just thought I'd point that out because I have had a lot of pushback lately on entities no longer wanting to do their RLFs, but they don't want to return the money either. So
Good point, Cindy. And then that's right with equipment too. If you purchased equipment or land through that program, then that reporting continues on an annual basis. And if at some point you would like to sell that property, then there's a process to go through at that time too.
Right.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. Okay, within 90 days after the conclusion of the project, a final project performance report is required that would include your final financial status report. So that's 90 days after the conclusion of the project. We deem that it's completed. And then the final funding will not be dispersed to the grantee within 42 months of the date of obligation. So there is an opportunity if for some unforeseen circumstances arise and there would need to be an extension, there is an opportunity to extend a project up to 36 months, but it would, that's not, that's not common. Those are for unforeseen circumstances. So be sure that when you're thinking about developing or designing your project, that it is something that can be achieved in a year. These are for uncertain circumstances. So let's go ahead to the next slide. This is my contact information and Cindy's. I do want to remind you though that kind of your first line of defense is at the state level and reaching out to your USDA Rural Development, Rural Business Service staff and establishing those relationships if you haven't already. I did make available the USDA Rural Development, Rural Business Development Grant Toolkit. I'm not sure if that's something that we can pull up, but if not, I think that is available. Maybe we can get that posted, Dan, to a site that you all have.
Yeah, we will. Hang on, let me try to pull up a link for it quick. All right, but I think we have a link on the program. If you click on that the chat box and look at the program for the rural business development. You should be able to pull it up there.
And this is, I don't want to go through this page by page, but I just wanted to note that there is an application checklist within this toolkit that's really, really a good format for you to follow if you're putting an application together. It identifies all of the required forms, similar to what is required for VAPG, but these are really important because if these are left out, it could potentially result in an ineligible application. Environmental requirements, you'll learn in there if it's something, if that would be needed for your project and how to address that. Working your way through the summary information and organizational documents that would be required, project eligibility, and helping to determine if your project should be considered for enterprise funding or opportunity grant funding. And then there's the actual application template that's located within this toolkit itself, and you can type right into that. A lot of the information that's needed for the Rural Business Development Grant is provided and becomes part of the appendices. So make sure that you don't forget that. Appendix A is your organizational documents. We're going to want to see bylaws, articles of incorporation, letters or certificates of good standing from your Secretary of State or organization. Those are all vary based on the type of organization or applicant. The Appendix B is the proposed scope of work. Appendix C is supportive financial documentation. And from here, we'll want to see the last 3 years financial statements, including balance sheets, income statements, and any audited reports that might be available. Appendix D is supplemental funds verification. We talked about this earlier. If you do have matching funds that you would like to include as part of this application, making sure that appropriate documentation is available to support that in terms of a signed letter from the source of the funds, stating the amount, when the funds will be available to support the project. And then Appendix D is documentation of experience. And we talked about this too, is documenting the experience of the staff or the organization that will be involved in implementing this particular project. And then finally, Appendix F is letters of support. And this is a really critical component that we see a lot of mistakes, I think, on from applicants. These letters of support are not necessarily letters from the Chamber of Commerce or your local economic development authority. These are letters from businesses that would receive some type of training or benefit from the project itself. And taking it one step further, that from the service that's provided or the training that they receive, that they might be able to be in a position to create additional jobs based on their participation or association with the project. So that's all clearly identified in there. You'll want to make sure that you pay special attention to that so that full credit can be achieved for that scoring criteria. I just can't say this enough. Make sure that you're, establishing that relationship with your state office, and let those folks know that you're interested in making an application, and see if there's some. They can give you an idea of what their average funding levels are that they see for projects. That might guide you. As Ted mentioned earlier, $500,000 is sort of the cap on the Rural Business Development Grant Program. I think it's safe to say that we almost never see that much. But there are some larger amounts that are available and are awarded through the set aside. So keep that in mind as well. So I'll be glad to answer any questions that may have popped up.
Yeah, there's one question I think we haven't addressed yet, and are the staff of the states aware of the set-aside programs? Generally, yes, and we have had quite a bit of turnover. So if you happen to run into someone who's new to the agency or maybe has never worked with a tribe before, of course, there's some states that only work with one tribe. So places like South Carolina or North Carolina might be less aware of the tribal set-aside programs, for instance, you can always circle back with me, and Lisa or I or someone from the rural business program staff can work to make sure they're up to speed on the different types of set-asides that are available. But there's training and there's documentation that goes out to those folks, but some folks are more familiar with them than others. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing lots of applications in a couple weeks.
Yeah, Dan, did you see any other questions that were coming through on the chat?
No, but want to open up. Does anyone have any additional questions? I know that it's only a couple of weeks until this rural business development grant is due. Fortunately, there is still quite a bit within this application. It's not quite as long as value-added producer grant. So I think, especially if you've got a grant writing team, it's not that difficult to pull it together.
Yeah, there's one question I'll pose for Lisa until someone else maybe asks another one. It's about the grant dollars going directly to a business or the business's owner. In tribal contexts, tribes have corporations and tribes own businesses and enterprises directly, and that's been an issue. So do you know what current guidance is on grants going directly to business and pass-throughs? I know it's not allowed, but is there a current unnumbered letter or administrative notice on that topic?
Not that I'm aware of. I'll ask Cindy if she's seen anything either. I'm not aware of any unnumbered letters that are being developed or have been developed related to that matter. Cindy, can you?
You're correct, Lisa. There is none other than the guidance that is outlined in the regulation that states pass-throughs are not an eligible purpose under the program, and that would be a grantee, an eligible grantee coming in to get the funds and then just handing it off to an entity that was not eligible to apply themselves. That would be a pass-through, and it's not eligible, and the only guidance is what's in the regulation.
And it does get a little bit tricky in Indian country because of the way tribes own their own corporations, or might have set up corporations with an arm's length distance from the tribal government, or are operating enterprises directly. So if you have any questions, please reach out to us, and just remember that the Rural Business Development Grant is what we consider an intermediary program. So for instance, where that relationship is clearly articulated and allowable is like in a business incubator, where a tribe could own a building or a facility, and they might pay for some equipment or pay for some services that are being provided, training, for instance, to tribal member entrepreneurs. And then those folks might be hoteling or using that office infrastructure to help grow their businesses. That's perfectly allowable. But for a tribe to get a grant and then to pass the dollars through directly to those businesses, that's not allowable. So
we do have another question on for Appendix B scope of work. Is the appendix required if it's not significantly different than what's included in the work plan narrative for the application?
The Appendix B gives you a better opportunity to expand on what your project summary would entail, your project narrative. There's some key criteria that you'll make sure you want to address, and then Appendix B just gives you an opportunity to expand on that a little bit more as to where the actual application itself may limit you in terms of how much text you can include there if you're using the template itself.
Great. Well, I think that I don't see any more questions. Thank you so much, Lisa, and for all of our and Cindy and all of our rural development staff for joining us today. And thank you for everyone who took the time to tune in today and to learn about both these programs. Again, these recordings will be available on the IAC YouTube channel.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Kier.